I was raised that slavery was a certain thing, that the way it was in, say, Alabama or Mississippi or Virginia, whatever, that was slavery, right? And then I assumed that that's the way slavery was everywhere. But that's not the truth, right? What really ends up happening is that the United States actually develops the world's only self-propagating slave population, meaning that the only place where slave populations actually grow without adding new slaves is in the United States. We have basically two different perceptions of race in the Americas, okay? And one of them, the one that we know about, the one in America, is basically binary. And what that means is you're either black or white. The other one is more of a spectrum. So basically, in a binary system, you're either black or you're white. And what determines whether you're black is what?
One drop of black blood, basically. If you have any ancestors or have descended from any people of African descent, you're automatically black.
Right, okay. But now let's think about this for a minute. Let's say that even if it was possible for there to be such a thing as black blood, do you think it's possible? Do you think there's such a thing as black blood? Do you think there's such a thing as Irish blood, English blood, Jewish blood? No, blood is chemistry. There isn't any innate characteristic of blood that goes along with ethnicity or geographical origin. So there isn't any such thing as black blood. But even if there was, right, then how would you know if somebody had one drop? Like lay it out all on the floor, cut them open, lay all their blood out on the floor and say, well, there's one, I see one. There's a black drop right there, right? You guys get what I'm saying? It's a silly notion, okay? Now, what they really did really wasn't, actually a measurement of blood. It was actually by vision, okay? And that causes some problems because of the miscegenation in the South, where the blacks and whites would procreate, often because the owners were trying to create more slaves, but that led to a whitening of certain offspring, so that a certain white person could actually, or a person who had black ancestry could pass as white, and you wouldn't be able to tell, right? But anyway, so that point here then is that in North America, we have the binary system. And so the perception of race in North America is you're either black or you're white. And that if you are, well, I should say it this way, the only way that you can have privilege is by being white. And then now, one of the things that we have to understand is that there's something called whiteness studies, because really the white race didn't exist before racism existed. And it really ends up being the most well defined in America, in the United States, okay? And the reason for that is because if you were to consider who actually had privilege in North America at the beginning of the United States, it wasn't only white people, but it was only certain white people, right? And those certain white people were Anglo-Saxon Protestants, essentially, who were either from England or from somewhere in Scandinavia, okay? But there were no Catholics, there were no Jews, there were no Irishmen or anybody else. They were not privileged, okay? And even many people who were Anglo were not privileged, right? As we'll talk about later. Okay, so then as time goes by, what we're going to see is that different groups come to America, and when they come to America, they're going to be excluded in very much the same way as Black people are excluded. For example, I don't know if you guys know this, but we'll probably do a little bit of work on this later in the course, right? When the Irish came to America, many Irish came in the 1840s, but they were Catholic and they spoke funny, right? And they were poor, right? And so the idea of the people who were who were native, who called themselves native, who had been born in America, right, who were of Anglo-Saxon blood, as if there was such a thing, right, would look at these Irish and say, well, look, they're just a bunch of drunks and they're dirty and they're Catholic and they fight all the time and they try to take our jobs away from us, right? Does that sound familiar? Right? And they're drinkers. They're all drunks, right? All of that comes from antipathy toward Irish immigrants from the native lower class in America. But what we see happening is that these different groups, we could be the Irish, and then later on it will be the German Catholics, and then it will be the Polish and Eastern Europeans and Italians will come to America, and they will at first be excluded, but they will be able to work their way into whiteness so that eventually they will be recognized as white and have the privileges of being white. So when we talk about the way that these immigrants were treated when they came to America, they were treated as badly as racism, but it wasn't really racism, because there was this idea that they could actually grow out of it, that they weren't irredeemable, that they could become equal. But Black people could never become equal. And other groups, Asians could never become equal. Some people think Middle Easterners can't become equal. Because why? Because there's some deficiency in their blood. And that's why today you see people who claim that people from the Middle East, people from Latin America, people from Africa are going to ruin our country. People from Asia are going to ruin our country because they're not capable of democracy. That's where that comes from. That's where that idea all comes from, okay? So the way that we're going to say it then is that in North America, the concept of race essentially evolves to whiteness equals privilege. If you're white, you have privilege. If you're not white, you do not have privilege, right? But whiteness itself is a kind of a fluid concept. Okay, now in the rest of the Americas, because they have a significant third population, like they did in Brazil, for example, or Mexico, or Cuba, whatever, right? Because in those places, there were not just Black and white, but there was another group of Indians, right? So we had the whites and the Indians and the Blacks, right? Okay, so now the privilege actually was still oriented towards whiteness, but it wasn't binary, meaning that the closer to white you were, the more privilege you could have, okay? And so there were actually levels. They had names of these. In Mexico, they called them castas, right? And I'm going to give you guys an extra credit on castas because there were actually paintings that they did in Mexico that would show, what was the shade of the skin, right? And then what kind of privileges they had, okay? And so then that's where we see this kind of hierarchy of race, okay? But the problem, I shouldn't say a problem. I guess one other difference is that if you're in America, if you're Black, you're always going to be Black. You can never become white, okay? It's impossible, okay? But if you are in this society, you can live somewhere between no privilege and privilege, all right? So let's say the mixture of whites and Indios is mestizos, and the mixture between whites and, the mixture between whites and Blacks is mulattoes, and then the difference between Indio and Black is zambos or castas. But the point here is that you could fall somewhere in between here by your birth. If you had, a completely white father and a completely native mother, you would come out as a mestizo, right? But you could actually pay to move up, right? You could pay to move up to another level. You couldn't pay to become white, but you could pay to become closer to white. Why would you do that?
Privileges.
Exactly, you get more privilege. So what that tells us then is that racism in Spanish America isn't quite the same as racism in North America, because your race wasn't something that was hereditary. It was something that you could actually change. It was a social construction, basically, that you could alter. Not that you could alter it completely. It was racist in the point that none of these people who were mixed race could ever become white, okay? But they could move up and down in privilege. You guys get what I'm saying? Questions, comments? All right, so that's the difference between racism in North America and racism in the rest of the Americas. It's a very different way of experiencing race. But the one thing that we don't want to think about is which one is better.
Neither.
Why not? Why isn't this one better? In this one, I can actually move up if I want to. Can't go all the way, but at least I can move up, right? But in this one, I cannot move up at all. I never can move up, right? So why isn't this one better than that one?
Because people are still being mistreated based on the color of their skin.
Exactly. So it's not better. Neither one of them is better than the other. It's just different. Okay. Now there's one other aspect of this, and this is where we talked about earlier how the United States develops the only self-propagating slave population. Okay, and that's the reason for that is because in the rest of the Americas, right, say Cuba or Brazil, right, slaves did not reproduce. And so what would happen would be, I mean, they did, but not at any significant rate, okay? Because they were just being worked too hard and they just didn't have the whatever, right? But anyway, the point here is that what would happen would be if you were a slave in Spanish America, you would be forced to work, and you without any kind of support at all, no rest, right? And you would be able to last usually about 6 years, right? And at the end of 6 years, you could no longer work. And so you were of no value to the slave owner. So the slave owner would free you, right? But he wasn't freeing you so that you could go live happily ever after. He was freeing you because he didn't have to feed you anymore, right? And you could just go off somewhere and die. You guys get it? Okay, so in North America, because slaves were harder to get, more expensive, and then after 1807, the slave trade in the United States was illegal, right? And that meant that if you were going to keep your slaves, you had to produce. If you're going to have slaves, you needed to produce more, right? And so what ends up happening is that in North America, there is a push or movement toward slave reproduction, and the slaves are treated like animals rather than like machines, right? Meaning they're treated like livestock. Okay, you can breed them and you can get more that way, but you want to get as much value out of them as possible. So you will not essentially work them to the point that they can't survive. And so slaves could live longer lives in North America, right? But they could never become free because there was no, the owner had no reason to free them. So in North America, slaves are treated more like livestock. And in the rest of the Americas, they're treated like machines. In our day, if you buy a car, it lasts about 10 years, and after about 10 years, it doesn't work anymore. So you get rid of it and you buy a new one. But you can't do that in North America. So instead, what you do is you treat it like a horse or like anything that you're growing that you're using that can bring you value over a longer period of time that's hard to replace. All right, so there's the difference between slavery in the Americas and slavery in the rest, between slavery in North America and the rest of the Americas. When we think about slavery in North America, I think we have a real tendency in the United States, right, to think of it as a kind of a unique situation in the United States that nobody else in the world had any problem with, race and racism. But if we look at this race and slavery situation in other areas, That gives us a broader perspective. It doesn't make what we know wrong, but it makes it more, it makes us able to differentiate better.